is now day 86 since Nancy Guthrie disappeared, literally just vanished out of her home in Tucson, Arizona. Still no real explanation, still no suspects. It's been almost 3 months. And you guys remember before Nancy Guthrie disappeared, and I've reported on this before, there was this reality show that was set to tape and had already started taping with the Pima County Sheriff's Office. Well, now there are some emails that have come out through a public records request. Fox Digital actually got them. They're just interesting because they showed the behind the scenes of the Sheriff's Office. They also talk about the fact that there were changes in leadership positions in homicide and also in the cold case unit, which is something that I've reported a lot about. The fact that experienced leaders were moved around by the sheriff. I wanted to ask you some questions about some of this new information that's come out in the Nancy Guthrie investigation and some of the information that I've learned from some of the profilers that I talked to. And I wanted to see, like, as an agent, how you would put that into action actually with the investigation. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about is this new information coming from Brianna Whitney, who's a reporter with the CBS station in Phoenix. And that's one of the stations that received the first two ransom letters, the ones that we believe Savannah was referencing when she said that she thought two were real. And they're now divulging, the station, that when they looked back into the Bitcoin wallet, there was activity on February 10th, and there's been no activity since. So this would have been a couple of months ago, right when the letters first came out. And a small amount of money was put into the account, along with a note that said, "We are ready to talk, contact us." And then there was a link for how to reach out to them. And there's no way to know for sure that that was the FBI or Savannah Guthrie, but it seems like it would kind of make sense. What do you think it means that they put that note in there, but it seems there was no response?
Well, I don't think we know that there was no response. There was no response that was visible to us. But I think that what that is the FBI saying, if it was the FBI, which makes sense, it's them saying, "Hey, we're in a negotiation here. This is not something where we're going to play the game where you just dictate terms to us, because it's that whole thing. Well, this is your only mother. You want her back, so you better meet our terms." And they would say, "We're your only victims, so if you don't get money from us, you don't get a dime." So we're both in this, a zero-sum end game. I mean, this is big. And so there is wiggle room in negotiations. I can guarantee you, not every negotiation, but it really depends on how you do the negotiation. If you start, I know this sounds horrible, but it's like negotiating on a house or a car price, where if you come in and seem desperate, they will not budge. If they come in and seem truly, yes, we desperately want her back, but we're not going to set a precedent for future crimes, things like this, then you're forcing them into a negotiation. So I think what the FBI was telling them is, this is not you make a demand, we fulfill the demand.
This is a negotiation, and this is how it works. 86 days ago, Nancy Guthrie vanished from her Tucson home. In Tucson, Arizona, Nancy, who is 84, remains missing. No suspects have been arrested, and no one is charged. The lead everyone thought would break this case open, a Bitcoin wallet in a ransom note, went completely unused by agents. The FBI never sent a single dollar. The question remains, why did the Bureau ignore that specific ransom demand? We need to know where Nancy is, but also why the FBI saw the wallet address and chose total silence. That decision was not an accident. The FBI does not ignore ransom demands. When they refuse to engage, it is calculated. They analyzed the evidence and reached a specific conclusion. Whatever that conclusion was, it has dictated every move since. This forensic pivot has shaped the entire investigation. So let us break down exactly what happened to Nancy Guthrie. Nancy Guthrie lived in Tucson, Arizona. At 84, she lived a quiet life, an unlikely target for a federal investigation. But the moment she vanished and the ransom note surfaced, the FBI stepped in to lead the search effort. This tells us something critical right away. The FBI does not enter every missing persons case without specific federal indicators. They come in when federal indicators like kidnapping or ransom appear, signaling a crime beyond local jurisdiction. 2 ransom notes surfaced early in this investigation. Both contained a Bitcoin wallet address, which is a digital payment method. These communications surfaced early on. Both contained a wallet address. For anyone unfamiliar, Bitcoin is a digital currency. Digital currency exists solely online, allowing funds to move across the internet without ever touching a traditional bank. When laundered carefully, the recipient becomes nearly impossible to identify, which explains why career criminals seeking massive ransom payouts have pivoted toward cryptocurrency, as the perceived anonymity makes tracing far harder for law enforcement. So when those 2 messages surfaced alongside a specific Bitcoin wallet address, those tracking the investigation sensed a major tactical shift. This appeared to be tangible progress, a direct line of communication to reach whoever was holding Nancy Guthrie, offering a path to negotiate her return. Yet the FBI never sent Bitcoin. No public confirmation ever surfaced, and there was certainly no press conference detailing any form of active hostage negotiation. No federal statement confirmed that funds were transferred to secure Nancy's release or satisfy the captors. Agents analyzed the wallet and the messages, then made the tactical choice to hold back. Understanding the clinical reality of how professional kidnappings function is essential to grasping what happened next. Comparing a genuine ransom scenario to the specifics of Nancy's disappearance reveals gaps that are not just small, they are glaring. These discrepancies are significant, and they likely drove the FBI to make their controversial final decision. In a standard kidnapping for profit, the captors prioritize one single objective above all else, securing a massive cash payout. Because their goal is purely financial, every tactical move is designed to ensure constant communication and keep the pressure high. They never go silent after a single message. Instead, they set aggressive deadlines to remind the family that time is fading. Most critically, professional captors provide proof of life through a recording, a photo, or a call that confirms the victim is alive and worth the investment, because in high-stakes ransoms, proof is never optional. This proof serves as the foundation for negotiations, as without it, grieving families have zero reason to believe. Without proof, paying achieves nothing, and the FBI has no forensic confirmation that a living victim actually exists. Without it, there is no hope of a return. Proof of life is the only factor that maintains ransom credibility. In the case of Nancy Guthrie, there was absolutely zero proof of life and no forensic evidence of her survival. She was never seen again after the abduction, leaving no photographic evidence or recorded messages for the investigators. Nothing provided investigators or her family the certainty that Nancy was out there somewhere, still breathing and waiting. There were no escalating demands after those 2 initial messages. The line went dead and no follow-up arrived. No second round of pressure followed, nor were there new deadlines or amended demands. Instead, there was no contact at all. Only those 2 messages. And that Bitcoin wallet remained before a total silence that became the core of the story. If a kidnapper is holding a victim for a ransom payout, they do not suddenly drop off the radar. Going silent is the opposite of their goal, as it allows the intense pressure on the family to vanish. Silence gives investigators a window to breathe, analyze evidence, and build a forensic case without the constant chaos of demands. While active negotiation would fracture police focus, going quiet is the single worst strategy for any kidnapper to get paid. Professional kidnappers do not stop talking. So what does it mean when the ransom demands end and nothing follows? It suggests 2 options: either something prevented further contact, or we are looking at much darker, more violent possibilities. Or, quite possibly, those communications were never part of a legitimate negotiation to begin with. Given the FBI response patterns during this investigation, agents seem to lean heavily toward that second grim theory. The ransom may have been a complete fabrication, a realization that fundamentally alters the entire shape of the homicide case. If the Bitcoin wallet was not intended for a real kidnapping payout, then it served a much different purpose. It was established not to collect funds, but as a tactical distraction embedded within those messages to achieve another goal. What could a fraudulent ransom demand actually accomplish? More than you think, as even a false demand can do damage. It immediately misdirects investigators the moment law enforcement spots a Bitcoin wallet in a note. Their tactical resources shift. Specialized units are assigned to the wallet, working feverishly to trace the address and identify the person who created it. They monitor every transaction, a grueling process that drains both time and valuable investigative manpower. Every hour spent chasing a manufactured lead is another hour lost that could have been spent searching for the truth. Fake ransoms also generate false hope, which acts as a powerful psychological tool for anyone trying to buy time. When families believe a ransom demand is real, they cling to the belief their loved one is still alive. They focus on the money in the wallet, believing a negotiation is actually possible, searching for a point of contact. While fixed on that link, they stop asking the questions that actually matter. Other possibilities vanish. This false hope creates a narrow tunnel vision, precisely as the mastermind behind the scheme intended. A ransom demand broadcast through the media adds a strange layer to this case, ensuring maximum public scrutiny immediately. Real kidnappers demand total privacy. They need communications restricted strictly to themselves, the family, and the authorities involved. They avoid the public eye. Cameras, reporters, and online sleuths dissecting every syllable of a ransom note represent a fatal risk. Massive public exposure is a death sentence for anyone committing a crime purely for a quick financial payout. Yet, in the Nancy Guthrie case, these ransom messages went global, dominating every major news cycle and headline. They were scrutinized by millions. An audience far beyond the immediate family and the FBI watched this play out. Real ransoms do not function like this. This was not a negotiation, it was a carefully staged performance. Investigators reached that same conclusion. As they evaluated the evidence, the word performance became the center of their theory. Look at these ransom demands, not as a reach for cash, but as a calculated spectacle meant to be witnessed by the world. This was theater, crafted to implant a very specific narrative in the minds of the public and the police. The bizarre behavior finally aligns. It makes sense as a hoax, whereas the legitimate kidnapping theory falls apart completely. That crypto wallet was never meant to hold Bitcoin. Its only function was to serve as a narrative device. A story where Nancy Guthrie was snatched by a mysterious stranger, a greedy antagonist, reachable only through an encrypted digital currency. If the right people played along, the investigators would follow this false trail while the actual truth remained hidden in the shadows. The FBI saw through the facade almost immediately. Their tactical shifts and sudden change in behavior serve as the proof. They never authorized a Bitcoin transfer. They refused to treat that digital wallet as a legitimate tool for negotiation. No press conferences detailed active negotiations. Instead, the Bureau went quiet, signaling a major pivot in their forensic strategy. This was not the silence of defeat. It was the calculated quiet of agents who had moved to a more productive lead. You have to understand how the FBI operates in these high-stakes scenarios. Their methodology is clinical and absolute. Once they determine a ransom is a fake, they do not just walk away. They double down on the deceiver. They demand answers to the next logical question. If money was not the motive, then what was the goal? Who gains if the world buys the kidnapping story? Those questions force the investigation into a much darker, more personal direction. Financial gain is a straightforward motive. A victim is taken, a price is set, and the demand is delivered. It is cold and logical in its cruelty. But once the profit motive evaporates, the case opens up into something complex. New possibilities emerge: revenge, obsession, or the raw desire to exert total control over a person. The focus shifts to psychological pain. There is a twisted satisfaction in terrifying someone who wronged you. This is about punishing a target you can no longer tolerate. Irrational crimes often sharpen into focus the moment you stop looking for a financial trail and start looking for a person. That shift happens when emotions become the primary evidence. Investigators in the Nancy Guthrie case clearly made that tactical pivot early. They abandoned the wallet and the Bitcoin trail. They realized this was never about a transaction or a simple wire transfer. Their focus moved to the human element. They scrutinized personal histories and every individual within Nancy's immediate social circle. This process identifies anyone connected to Nancy with a motive for destruction that had absolutely nothing to do with cash. That pivot is crucial. It confirms that law enforcement was not stalled or sitting idle in a generic briefing room. They were not staring at a Bitcoin address waiting for activity. They were hunting people, real suspects with real baggage. Human beings, unlike anonymous cryptocurrency wallets, always leave a trail of digital and physical breadcrumbs behind them. Behavior, relationships, and history all leave permanent marks. These are the forensic traces that are impossible to fully scrub away. How a suspect speaks about a victim, their reaction to interrogation, and how their story shifts under pressure are all vital clues. Everything leaves a mark. Behavioral analysts are specifically trained to hunt down these subtle, psychological indicators of guilt. Even if a suspect believes their cover is perfect, they cannot account for the physical evidence layer waiting beneath the surface. Even a meticulously planned crime leaves hair fibers or touch DNA on a surface that was gripped or pressed in a panic. Digital footprints from a burner phone or a vehicle caught on a doorbell camera at 3 a.m. create an undeniable timeline that cannot be erased. Physical evidence remains indifferent to how clever the killer thinks they are. It simply exists, waiting for a forensic team. Modern forensic technology has evolved. It can now visualize microscopic details that would have been completely invisible just 10 years ago. Evidence exists. It waits to be found. Modern forensic technology has reached a tipping point where the invisible is now undeniable. Forensics that were completely undetectable 2 decades ago have become readable, traceable, and weaponized in a modern courtroom. The margin between executing a perfect crime and leaving a forensic footprint is far tighter than most offenders actually comprehend. Special agents understand this reality, operating on the certainty that physical evidence is out there, just waiting for confirmation. This forensic persistence is exactly why the Nancy Guthrie file remains active, even as we hit day 86. Nancy Guthrie remains missing with 0 sightings or proof of life, yet this investigation is far from stagnant. Federal agents refused to transfer any Bitcoin because they identified critical red flags in how those ransom notes functioned. They determined the demand was never a legitimate negotiation, but rather a staged distraction built into the initial crime scene. This entire facade was engineered to divert resources and buy time for an individual with a non-financial, calculated agenda. That assessment is both clarifying and deeply alarming because it proves the Bureau is working a specific theory. They are not chasing a phantom, they are analyzing hard behavioral data and physical markers that lead directly to one individual. It is a grim realization that Nancy Guthrie was likely targeted for reasons beyond simple financial gain. This was likely about something far more intricate, deeply rooted in her identity and her private professional circle. That specific link, the one that potentially marked Nancy for reasons unrelated to her character, is the key factor. This connection is what we examine next. As we dig into the evidence, a fundamental question emerges that redefines this entire disappearance. What if Nancy was never the primary objective? 2 ransom demands and a single Bitcoin wallet are all we have. The FBI analyzed both and refused to pay a single cent, which is where our first chapter ended. Now we have to scrutinize that digital wallet, what it was not, and what the Bureau saw. Their forensic scan was thorough enough to stop the payment. Creating a Bitcoin wallet is not a complex process. Any person with a laptop can generate 1 in 5 minutes without providing a single piece of ID. No names are required and no addresses are logged. One click creates a string of alphanumeric characters. This allows for global currency transfers, making it the primary choice for modern criminal operations. It is the go-to for those avoiding identification, but there is a massive flaw most people overlook. A Bitcoin address is public by its very design, meaning every single deposit and withdrawal is visible. Every cent moved is logged on the blockchain, which functions as a public ledger. Anyone can audit it, viewing exactly what has entered or exited any specific wallet address. Federal agencies, including the FBI, employ specialized teams dedicated strictly to blockchain forensics. They utilize advanced software to track digital assets across multiple wallets while flagging any highly suspicious transactional patterns. Often, they can de-anonymize these transfers. So, when that specific wallet address surfaced in the ransom notes, the Bureau did not just see a random string of text. They saw a forensic trail ready for analysis. They saw evidence that could be mapped and traced, and what they discovered inside that digital ledger was telling. More importantly, it was what they did not find that revealed the true nature of this kidnapping demand. A wallet built for a legitimate ransom usually displays very specific signs of tactical preparation. It shows the operator has carefully planned the logistics of the payoff. The funds move through established pathways and connect to digital infrastructure typically utilized by professional criminal groups. This is how a serious offender ensures they get paid. It functions like a precision tool for a transaction. Timing is also a major indicator. Was the wallet created days or weeks before Nancy was taken? Premeditated creation suggests a long-term plan to extort cash, but was it generated in a rush? If it was built moments before the messages were sent, it was likely thrown together for a different motive. That is a far cry from professional financial crime, and these forensic details are vital to the investigation. There is a massive divide between a professional digital setup and a wallet scrambled together by an amateur. If they only needed the illusion of a ransom, it tells us exactly who we are really hunting. The behavior of the wallet after the notes were sent is even more revealing. Did anything move? Did anyone try to access it? Or did it remain stagnant, proving the sender was never waiting for any money to arrive based on the Bureau's tactical response? The account sat completely still. Nothing moved. No funds were sent by the family or by the FBI in any capacity. No undercover activity was ever publicly confirmed, and no wallet activity suggested the creator was monitoring the balance or waiting for deposits. It behaved like an abandoned prop, visible, but disconnected from any entity that genuinely intended for the wallet to be used for transactions. That data point alone shifted federal strategy. But when combined with everything else, the total absence of proof of life, the profile changed. The silence and the lack of follow-up communications or escalating pressure changed the forensic picture. This was no kidnapper waiting for payday. Instead, someone created the facade of an abduction and then stepped back to watch the aftermath unfold. This was a tactical performance. Now, consider the psychology of that act. What kind of mind constructs a ransom scenario not for money, but for effect? This was no simple crime of opportunity. This was not someone who snatched Nancy Guthrie randomly and then improvised a ransom demand. Constructing digital communications and selecting a Bitcoin wallet required methodical intent and planning. This was a calculated and highly deliberate act. Making those demands public required an offender who understood the mechanics of an investigation and the impact those choices would produce. All of that required deep planning. It required an offender who understood the mechanics of an investigation and how things work. That level of calculation points toward a motive running deeper than money. Pure greed usually takes a path of least resistance. People motivated by financial gain choose the approach most likely to produce a fast payment. They do what real kidnappers do. Contact, pressure, proof of life, and deadlines work. Those tactics produce results because they have worked for criminals throughout history. Someone who creates a demand but skips those steps is ignoring the proven formula. They are doing something entirely different. They are using the vocabulary of a ransom and the implicit threats to accomplish a goal unrelated to receiving Bitcoin. What was the goal? The FBI likely worked backward from the moment they proved the ransom demand was staged. Working backward from a staged ransom leads you to ask specific questions about the motive and the intended target. Who benefits from the existence of this ransom demand regardless of whether any money ever actually changes hands? Who gains while investigators burn resources tracking a dead Bitcoin wallet instead of looking elsewhere for suspects? Who benefits from keeping the Guthrie family trapped in a cycle of false hope for her safe return? Who benefits from them waiting for her home rather than confronting more permanent and darker possibilities? Who gains while the media focuses on a nameless thief instead of a known person with a personal motive? These questions have a direction. They point towards someone in Nancy Guthrie's world who wanted the investigation pointed away. Someone who realized a ransom would generate the noise and confusion needed to buy the ultimate asset. They needed misdirection and false leads that would buy them exactly the thing they needed most: time and distance. The space between her disappearance and the moment anyone started looking in the right direction. Let us look at what the FBI knew about this behavior as vital context for their choices. The FBI employs a behavioral analysis unit dedicated to understanding the psychology behind these acts. These specialists analyze offender psychology, dissecting not just the act, but why specific choices were made. When analysts looked at the ransom communications, they applied a framework built from decades of studying staged scenes. The way a crime is staged reveals the stager. Every choice reflects the background of the offender. Every choice, the language, the platform, the Bitcoin wallet, reflects the knowledge and emotional state of the stager. Stagers believe they are creating a diversion. In reality, they are leaving a psychological fingerprint. The FBI reads those prints. In Nancy's case, they told a specific story about intent. The evidence pointed away from a financially motivated kidnapper and towards something much more personal. The account remained completely static. Nothing moved. No funds were sent by the family or law enforcement in any capacity. No undercover activity was confirmed, and no wallet activity suggested the creator was monitoring it or waiting for a deposit. It behaved like a hollow prop, visible, but disconnected from anyone who genuinely wanted it used for an actual transaction. That data point shifted federal strategy, but combined with everything else, the total absence of life proof, the profile changed. The lack of follow-up communications and escalating pressure made it clear. This was not a kidnapper waiting for a payday. Instead, someone created the appearance of an abduction and then stepped back to watch the aftermath unfold. Now, consider the psychology of that act. What kind of person constructs a ransom scenario just for an effect? The FBI reads those fingerprints. In Nancy's case, those fingerprints told a story about intent. The evidence pointed away from a financially motivated kidnapper and towards something much more personal. The probe pivoted away from a phantom and towards someone with direct, intimate ties to the case. This was no random assault, but the calculated strike of someone fueled by rage or toxic obsession. That transition in the profile shifting from a faceless digital extortionist to a known entity redefined the hunt. This pivot immediately tightened the focus, moving the objective away from sketching a vague, phantom kidnapper. Instead, federal agents began meticulously dissecting Nancy's inner circle, mapping every name, every face, and every history. They scrutinized old wounds, analyzing past betrayals, and cataloging every recorded instance of hostility or direct threats. They hunted for fractured behavior in those final days, and that exhaustive mapping process soon isolated a name. Or perhaps a short list of suspects who were already under surveillance, their every movement fueling investigative suspicion. Their evasive answers or flat refusals to cooperate spoke volumes. Just as the public spectacle began escalating, the ransom communication was broadcast to the masses, turning a private demand into a high-stakes media event. By utilizing national television and digital true crime forums, the sender ensured this narrative dominated every conversation. This guaranteed that millions of people would view the entire disappearance through the narrow lens of financial greed. Armchair detectives debated the Bitcoin address, constructing intricate theories around who could have possibly demanded the crypto. Every theory relied on the premise that Nancy was a high-value target snatched by a professional mercenary. That mass distraction was exactly what the perpetrator wanted, providing cover for a staged and deceptive scenario. It functioned as smoke and mirrors, keeping reporters and online sleuths obsessing over the digital wallet details. This directed attention away from the darker realities of personal history and the actual motive behind the crime. It forced the focus onto digital forensics while ignoring the erratic behaviors of those closest to the victim. The narrative was simple: a stranger wanted money, and that lie protected the person truly responsible. The FBI identified this tactic quickly and made a calculated choice not to indulge the suspect's performance. They refused to validate the staged crypto ransom, ignoring the demands to send Bitcoin to the provided address. This allowed the perpetrator to believe their stagecraft was working, while agents quietly dismantled their artificial story. Instead of chasing a digital shadow, investigators turned inward, applying high pressure to the suspect's inner circle. They abandoned the screen for the street, leveraging advanced behavioral profiling to crack the suspect's psychological armor. They stopped searching for an outsider and began weighing the actions of known individuals against forensic reality. Analysts compared hair samples, fiber transfer, and trace DNA recovered from critical points inside the family home. Digital logs were dissected, revealing precise timestamps of every call and text sent during the critical window. They canvassed the neighborhood, pulling high-definition security footage from every intersection to track the suspect's movements. Forensic accountants scrutinized financial ledgers, searching for the telltale signs of unusual transactions or long-term preparation. Every aggressive message and obsessive pattern was documented, creating a steel trap of evidence around the target. This is the slow, grueling reality of federal work, not the convenient resolution of a scripted television show. It demands total patience and the stomach to endure silence while the forensic puzzle pieces lock together. Those pieces were slowly aligning, though 86 days of hell is a lifetime for a grieving family. For 86 days, Nancy's loved ones lived in a state of psychological trauma that defies explanation. The public demanded instant justice, craving the closure that comes with seeing a monster in handcuffs today. Yet the investigation was moving with lethal precision, and the trajectory toward an arrest was finally clear. 86 days of relentless pressure have yielded a trove of behavioral analysis and hard physical evidence. The combination of digital forensics and field intelligence has finally rendered a vivid picture of the truth. It is a layered, forensic reconstruction of exactly how this crime was executed and who pulled the trigger. While the file may not be trial-ready just yet, the structural integrity of the case is undeniable. The foundation was laid the moment agents realized the ransom demand was nothing more than a desperate lie. The entire kidnapping was theater, and by seeing through the act, the FBI identified the lead actor. The identity of that performer is where this case descends into a truly dark and significant reality. A dark theory has been hardening inside the investigation, explaining the strategic purpose of that Bitcoin wallet. This is the theory building within the walls of the investigation, explaining the motive behind the Bitcoin wallet. The motive behind the creation, the public reveal, and the absolute lack of proof of life or subsequent pressure suggest a darker intent. This represents a reality Nancy Guthrie's family likely feared from the start. This was no random act. She was a specific target. The perpetrator possessed intimate knowledge of her identity and, more crucially, precise knowledge of her high-profile family connections. Nancy was never a random victim. This is the central conclusion federal investigators are now aggressively pursuing. Accepting that premise changes everything once you discard the theory of a cash-hungry stranger picking Nancy Guthrie by chance. The narrative shifts. By accident, the case transforms, the ransom feels wrong, and the tactical silence makes the whole scenario feel much heavier. Those staged communications take on a different weight when you realize the person responsible likely knew Nancy before the first move. Exactly who she was before they ever initiated the plot. This leads to one central question: why her? At 84 years old, she lived a quiet life in Tucson, Arizona, far removed from any sort of public spotlight. She lacks any history of conflict or controversy that would typically mark someone as a target for a personal vendetta. Outwardly, she is the last person you would expect to find at the heart of a high-stakes federal kidnapping investigation. She represents the type of citizen who should be safe, yet safety often depends on more than just your own actions. Sometimes vulnerability is about proximity, and Nancy Guthrie is tied directly to a name recognized by millions of Americans every day. That name is Savannah Guthrie, one of the most prominent and recognizable figures in the world of American broadcast journalism. As a longtime co-anchor of The Today Show, she has questioned presidents and world leaders while occupying a massive public stage. This is more than simple fame. It is the kind of visibility that places you inside millions of living rooms every morning, across the entire country, 5 days a week like clockwork. That level of exposure is both massive and constant. Under specific conditions, that fame becomes a liability not necessarily for Savannah herself, but for the family members she holds dear. Public figures lack the ability to filter their audience. They cannot control who is watching or who begins to focus. They cannot stop those who study them, those who fixate, or those harboring intense feelings. These emotions range from simple admiration to dangerous obsession. Often, the people closest to a high-profile target suffer the consequences. Family members living off-camera often possess zero protection against the fallout of that attention or the actions of a motivated stalker. Investigators now suspect that Nancy, being Savannah Guthrie's mother, is the primary reason she was selected as a tactical target. Consider the forensic implications. If the objective was never the Bitcoin ransom, then the entire scheme was theater. If that demand was merely a staged performance, then the true motive was far more personal and targeted. If Nancy was targeted for her link to Savannah, then the ultimate goal was clearly centered around the journalist herself. It was about inflicting trauma, projecting fear, and sending an undeniable message, a surgical attempt to strike her life in the most devastating way imaginable. Specifically, by targeting the woman she loved most. There is no faster way to shatter someone emotionally than to exploit their mother. No message carries more weight. For a person obsessed with Savannah or nursing a perceived grievance, this was a power move. For an individual consumed by a fixation, targeting an elderly woman in Tucson would represent the absolute pinnacle of control. It is the ultimate way to be heard, a way to say, I can reach you whenever I want. No matter how much security you think you have or how distant your family is from the spotlight, I can find you. This specific pattern of behavior has been scrutinized by federal analysts for decades. When a subject cannot reach their primary obsession directly, they pivot to the next most vulnerable option available. They seek out those the figure loves most, the soft targets who live without the benefit of a professional security detail. These are individuals living quiet lives in quiet neighborhoods with absolutely no reason to suspect they are in any danger. An 84-year-old woman in Tucson is the definition of a soft target. She lived without professional home security. There were no high-tech cameras monitoring her property line and no specialized team tasked with checking on her safety around the clock. Instead, she was just a mother living her life, connected solely by blood to a daughter who happened to be famous. Happened to be a major face in American media. In the mind of the perpetrator, that connection was everything. That single association was likely the only reason she was taken. Now, we must examine the psychology behind this specific obsession. Understanding this pathological behavior is key to grasping how federal agents are currently managing this high-stakes investigation. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit has constructed precise psychological profiles, specifically regarding subjects who target celebrities and the vulnerable people in their lives. These forensic models are built from decades of data. Forensic analysis of thousands of threatening communications and interviews with offenders reveals a distinct behavioral pattern. These messages targeted celebrities and journalists alike, and the resulting profiles consistently demonstrate a very specific psychological makeup. Individuals who transition from obsessive fixation to physical action share specific traits that bridge the gap between thought and crime. These suspects often harbor a deep sense of betrayal, fueled by a perceived slight from the victim or their status. They carry a long history of personal grievances and habitually blame others for their failures, nursing a toxic sense of victimhood. This perceived unfairness justifies extreme violence in their minds, while social isolation ensures no one challenges their distorted reality. Without healthy relationships to anchor them, they develop a grandiose sense of self-importance that fuels their dangerous descent. They truly believe their personal pain is so monumental that it warrants a dramatic and often violent public response. Broadcasting a ransom demand through media channels provides the emotional validation these individuals crave, regardless of the risk involved. Financial gain was never the primary objective, because for this offender, the true currency is the feeling of significance. They wanted to be the one who forced Savannah Guthrie to her knees, wielding enough power to steal something truly precious. They demand a global audience, and the public nature of these ransom communications satisfies that desperate need for attention. A private ransom note directed only to the family would only generate private terror, which simply was not enough. But a public demand generates massive media coverage, sparking endless television analysis and intense speculation throughout online communities. This exposure creates a massive spectacle serving the exact needs of someone driven by a craving for power and relevance. The spectacle is the ultimate goal, yet the FBI recognized this and refused to provide the oxygen it required. By refusing to respond publicly, agents avoided validating the performance or treating this theatrical display as a legitimate negotiation. They quietly dismantled the platform and shifted their tactical focus toward the individual they believed was operating behind the curtain. This is where the investigation hits a wall, presenting a specific forensic challenge that requires a deep understanding. Building a behavioral profile is a start, but identifying the specific individual responsible for the crime is another matter. Constructing a case that survives the scrutiny of a courtroom is difficult, as the FBI does not make arrests based on profiles alone. They rely on hard evidence, and when the primary communication channel is shrouded in mystery, the Bitcoin wallet was clearly designed to hide the user, meaning building a solid case requires extreme patience and precision. Success demands a methodical approach, carefully linking physical clues to digital footprints until the forensic chain of evidence is complete. Combining physical and behavioral evidence into a clear picture takes time, but it is necessary for a conviction. This thoroughness yields results that are incredibly difficult to refute when the FBI builds a case with such care. By assembling the facts piece by piece, they create a solid foundation that will not crumble under the pressure of cross-examination. The goal is a narrative that covers everything from initial planning to the final execution of the criminal act. This provides enough forensic detail for a jury to follow the story without gaps, and the physical evidence remains vital. Even without the complex digital trail, investigators have a significant amount of physical material to analyze at the scene. Nancy's home became a forensic site, and even the most controlled crime scenes usually yield some form of incriminating trace. Perhaps it is a stray fiber or a partial fingerprint left on a surface that the intruder never should have touched. A single footprint in a quiet hallway or a scent that a canine can track long after the suspect fled. Once visible traces vanish, touch DNA is critical in this specific case. Touch DNA consists of genetic material deposited through simple contact, like a hand on a table or skin against a wall. Any physical interaction with the environment can leave this trace, and it requires no blood or visible biological deposit. It relies solely on contact, and avoiding such contact is nearly impossible during the high stress of a crime. Inside the space where the crime happened, if the kidnapper entered Nancy's home, they left behind physical traces. Investigators believe they were inside, touching door handles, tabletops, and furniture while they moved through the private residence. They handled tools and materials to control the room, and every single touch point likely left behind a genetic signature. Forensic labs can extract and sequence this data, eventually comparing it against a known sample from a specific suspect. The FBI gathers genetic samples from suspects through several methods, including voluntary swabs and discarded personal items. They also utilize court orders to obtain samples when investigators can demonstrate enough probable cause to a judge. Once a known sample is secured, the laboratory begins the clinical comparison against the touch DNA evidence found at a processing a crime scene is pure clinical laboratory work, meticulous, exhausting, and precise, leaving no room for guesswork or ambiguity. Genetic evidence is absolute because DNA never lies, and it certainly won't shift its narrative to match a suspect's fabricated alibi. Layered on top is the massive digital footprint left behind when ransom demands are funneled through public media channels and encrypted platforms. Each laptop or phone used to draft those messages left a forensic signature, while service providers archived exactly which hardware accessed their networks. These logs track network activity down to the second, and email servers preserve metadata that persists long after a sender hits the delete button. Bitcoin transactions exist on an immutable public ledger, allowing forensic specialists to track the flow of digital currency with surgical precision and clarity. These experts identify patterns in the data, while subpoenaed phone records expose every contact made in the critical hours before Nancy Guthrie vanished. Pinged location data places suspects in incriminating areas they cannot explain, while browser histories reveal the calculated research behind a premeditated criminal act. The target was searching for information no innocent person would need, and their recent purchase history only becomes logical when viewed as preparation. This data trail only gains meaning within the framework of a cold, calculated crime, where every separate thread eventually snaps into place. With the FBI grinding away at this investigation for 86 days, the comprehensive intelligence picture they have constructed is now coming into focus. This internal profile likely contains classified details far beyond what has been leaked to the press, which leads us directly to reporter Brian Entin. Journalist Brian Entin has embedded himself in this investigation from day one, monitoring every development and legal maneuver with an uncompromising professional eye. Entin has tracked the case since the first 911 call, translating complex police procedures and forensic breakthroughs into a narrative the public can follow. This reporting offers a tactical perspective on federal strategy, serving as a vital lens for those trying to gauge the direction of the manhunt. Through his deep analysis, observers have been able to chart the shifting focus of the Bureau as they close in on their primary targets. Entin's dispatches confirm a critical fact. The FBI's refusal to pay the Bitcoin ransom was a tactical move, not a bureaucratic delay. Federal agents weren't paralyzed by the demands. Instead, they made a calculated, aggressive choice to ignore the instructions based on their own internal profiling. Highly trained profilers had already dissected the ransom notes and determined that the linguistics didn't match the behavior of a genuine kidnapping cell. Recognizing the ransom demand as a total fabrication allowed the Bureau to pivot their entire strategy toward a much more focused investigative path. A legitimate hostage scenario would have forced a cautious, defensive approach, but knowing the truth stripped away the need for delicate hostage negotiations. If agents truly believed a victim was being held at gunpoint, every single communication would be weighed against the immediate risk of a fatal outcome. The pressure to bring a victim home alive usually paralyzes an investigation, forcing agents to follow the rules set by the criminals themselves. In a hot negotiation, you can't move too fast or use high-pressure tactics because one wrong move might provoke a violent, irreversible response. When you realize the ransom demand is just scripted theater, those operational handcuffs are removed, and investigators can finally take off the kid gloves. Federal agents can then push forward with lethal efficiency, executing high-risk search warrants and aggressive interrogations that would normally be far too dangerous. They can bypass the games and direct every available forensic resource toward uncovering the grim reality of what actually happened to Nancy Guthrie. Instead of participating in a criminal's lie, 86 days of relentless investigative work have provided the Bureau with the leverage they desperately needed. The FBI is no longer working from a blank slate. They have moved past the preliminary stage of simply identifying potential suspects. They are likely in the final phase of verifying their primary theory, and now the critical focus narrows down to one single devastating question: who? Which specific person left the psychological and forensic trail that leads directly to the site where Nancy Guthrie met her tragic, violent end? This investigation isn't happening in isolation. It's anchored in a complex web of toxic relationships and a long history of documented personal contact. Federal agents have been meticulously charting years of conflict and connection, looking for the one friction point that finally resulted in this catastrophe. As the investigative map expands, specific names are recurring with disturbing frequency, forcing agents to apply more pressure to those specific personal links. Some subjects have provided statements that simply don't hold up under scrutiny, offering evasive answers that only deepen the Bureau's growing suspicions. One person of interest wasn't a stranger at all, but rather someone deeply integrated into the family's social circle and their private history. This individual was already positioned at the very heart of the family's life, and their name has now appeared in multiple witness statements. Their involvement appears far too calculated to be a mere coincidence, making it vital to understand the exact nature of their secret connection. Subjecting that personal relationship to intense forensic scrutiny is the next logical step in this hunt for a killer who was no stranger. We must now analyze the implications of this connection, because the tactical difference between a random attack and a targeted crime is massive. When the victim knows their attacker, the entire nature of the evidence shifts from random forensic luck to a calculated trail of personal motive. It becomes a question of long, simmering resentment, fundamentally changing how federal investigators build a case that will actually survive a high-stakes trial. This meticulous preparation ensures the conviction sticks, especially since random crimes are notoriously difficult to crack without an existing link to follow. Without a shared history or documented conflict, investigators are left with no clear motive to analyze and no established connections to follow. Random acts of violence remain the most difficult cases to close because there is no pre-existing relationship to expose and no motive to uncover. Zero digital footprint. Investigators found no communication records between the victim and offender before the incident occurred. Detectives are forced to construct a connection from nothing, radiating outward from the scene and the victim's inner circle. They grind until a single thread pulls tight. Crimes involving known associates follow a much more direct, clinical path. If the perpetrator shared a history with the victim or their inner circle, the investigation already has a forensic baseline. A pre-existing history exists. Records of digital interaction, verbal communication, and past behavioral patterns provide a roadmap before the strike. Analysts scrutinize these interactions against the timeline. Often, this pre-existing data is exactly where the most damning evidence is buried. For Nancy Guthrie, the FBI didn't start with a blank slate. They had a complex social world to dissect. Agents mapped the web of relationships surrounding Nancy, scrutinizing every individual tied to her private and professional life. A vast network emerged: people who knew her family, or held some strategic connection to the specific circumstances of the abduction. The evidence led law enforcement directly to her doorstep. As they cleared names, they applied rigorous behavioral analysis to every lead. They combined physical forensics with digital data. Under this intense scrutiny, specific individuals began to stand out as suspects. They didn't flag because of overt suspicion. Offenders who plan their movements with such precision rarely behave in obvious ways. Their behavior is more subtle, quietly wrong. It manifests as minor logical inconsistencies or answers that almost, but not quite, fit. These are psychological reactions that feel just slightly off from what the gravity of the situation should naturally produce. This level of dissonance is easy to miss without specialized training, but once spotted, it becomes impossible for investigators to ignore. The FBI is conditioned to detect those exact behavioral red flags, and in this case, they found them. The person currently under the most intense investigative heat maintains a direct, documented connection to the Guthrie family itself. This isn't just a casual acquaintance. We aren't talking about someone who merely crossed paths with Nancy a single time. They didn't just meet at a local fundraiser or pick her name out of a random neighborhood directory. This was personal. This is an individual whose life intersected with the Guthries in a capacity that granted them high-level insider knowledge. They possessed intimate knowledge of Nancy's strict routines, her home layout, and the specific rhythms of her private daily life. A total stranger would never have this data, and they certainly couldn't have gathered it without launching a massive surveillance operation. That access is critical for two reasons. One, it suggests the entire operation was engineered by someone with deep inside information. There was no need for long-range surveillance because they already understood Nancy's vulnerabilities well before they decided to move in. Second, it narrows the suspect pool to a fraction of the population. Very few people had that level of clearance. Few individuals have access to the private life of an 84-year-old woman. That short list is where detectives started digging. Now, let's examine what the behavioral profile of this individual actually reveals. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit constructed a forensic portrait of the offender based on the clinical evidence gathered. This profile was built on every forensic detail regarding how the crime was meticulously planned and ultimately executed. The psychological profile emerging from this evidence isn't that of a typical impulsive criminal acting on a whim. We aren't looking for someone who acted in a flash of blind rage or made a heat-of-the-moment decision they immediately regretted. Scripting those ransom demands and selecting a secure Bitcoin wallet required a level of cold, methodical planning and digital forethought. Making those demands public while using such specific, calculated language required a great deal of deliberate strategic thought. It required an offender who sat with this concept long enough to develop a tactical strategy around the entire operation. Even if that strategy was ultimately flawed, that level of premeditation tells investigators something vital about the suspect's mindset. It highlights the suspect's emotional state. Impulsive crimes happen when emotions hijack judgment, but this was far more clinical. Meticulously planned crimes are usually committed by individuals who have been nursing a deep-seated grievance or a specific feeling. It could be an obsession or a thirst for revenge that simmered until they finally decided to cross from feeling to action. The individual currently in the crosshairs of this investigation appears to fall squarely into that second, more dangerous category. This is a person who had been carrying a burden for years, someone whose resentment toward the Guthrie family had been building. Hostility toward Savannah specifically had been intensifying over time until it reached a breaking point where direct action felt necessary. What was the root of that hostility? That is the central question the FBI has been working to answer. Judging by the directions the FBI has pursued, the motive likely involves a volatile combination of psychological factors. These traits are common in cases where a fixated individual decides to target someone closely connected to a public figure. Entitlement is almost always present, specifically a belief they deserved attention or a relationship that they were ultimately denied. When attention or validation was withheld, a bitter resentment took root. Left to fester and fed by isolation, that grudge only deepened. It transforms into something far uglier, a volatile force seeking an outlet. It begins the dangerous process of finding a target. The mind builds justifications for actions no rational observer could ever defend. For a person in that fractured state, targeting Nancy Guthrie wasn't a random choice. To them, it felt like a cold, calculated, and entirely logical necessity. It felt like the final move on the board, the only action capable of forcing the response they had been denied elsewhere. Every other channel failed. The ransom note, the Bitcoin wallet, and the public taunts were all parts of the play. To this individual, it felt like a master stroke, a plan clever enough to succeed and sophisticated enough to command total control. It was designed to generate the precise fear, confusion, and media spotlight that their desperate need for significance demanded. But they failed to account for the FBI. Specifically, they ignored the tactical reality of a federal task force response. They didn't anticipate how fast investigators would pierce through their facade. They overlooked the fact that federal behavioral experts exist. Behavioral analysts have spent decades dissecting exactly these types of staged crimes. They completely disregarded the technical reach of forensics. A blockchain forensics team analyzed that Bitcoin wallet within hours of its discovery, tracking the digital trail with surgical precision. They missed the physical evidence left behind in a crime scene they mistakenly believed they had completely and totally controlled. Most critically, they failed to account for the people around them. Witnesses see what cameras often miss. In cases like this, the pattern is consistent. The offender talks. They don't speak to law enforcement, but they do talk. They confide in someone close, a scrap of conversation that sounded like venting at the time, but held a lethal weight. That dialogue contained specific details, a passing comment that seemed odd then, but transformed into a major red flag in retrospect. Maybe it was a reaction to the news of Nancy's disappearance, a response that was a bit too knowing, or perhaps too calm. They seemed too detached from the horror everyone else felt. People pay attention to those discrepancies. They remember everything. Those observations are filed away. When federal investigators start asking questions, those buried memories have a way of resurfacing. The FBI handles these interviews with clinical precision. They don't lead with accusations. They lead with a quiet, calculated curiosity. They utilize open-ended, strategically constructed questions designed to force the subject to fill the silence with their own narrative. The vocabulary people select while attempting to manage a high-stakes conversation with law enforcement is incredibly revealing to trained ears. What they emphasize, what they dodge, and the unprompted details they volunteer at all paints a picture of a guilty mind. The details they omit, things an innocent person would naturally mention, all serve as vital intelligence for the investigative team. Veteran investigators listen for the subtext. They analyze the silences and the precise moments of hesitation that occur a beat late. They look for answers that sound too practiced, responses that are a bit too smooth and lack the friction of truth. The stories are too polished, suggesting a rehearsal rather than a genuine memory. They watch for emotional responses that clash with the topic. Sustaining a lie under this kind of pressure is hard. Maintaining a deception across multiple interviews with professionals trained to spot inconsistencies is an almost impossible task for anyone. It is grueling work. The individual at the heart of this probe has already sat across from those investigators. Their alibi and their ties to the Guthrie family have been under intense scrutiny. That level of pressure inevitably exposes the cracks. Those fractures, when combined with the mounting pile of physical evidence and the digital footprint the FBI has spent 86 days mapping, form the foundation of the case against this person. That is the framework. Now consider the element that has completely dominated the public conversation surrounding this tragic case: the surveillance footage. During the window of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, local cameras caught something. They recorded a figure, a person whose physical appearance was very clearly and very deliberately obscured from the lens. Face covered, clothing picked to mask traits, and movements calculated to dodge every camera they knew was there. They worked to stay anonymous, evading any lens they suspected was watching. The mere existence of this shadowy figure, often called the masked individual in news reports, tells the investigative team several things with absolute certainty. First, the intentional concealment of their face and body confirms cold, hard premeditation. You do not hide your identity and mask your features by accident. That requires a plan. You do it because you considered the surveillance cameras in advance and chose to remain completely unidentifiable on film. You wanted to be invisible on the footage. Second, the presence of this figure in the recordings connected to Nancy's disappearance puts a person at the scene with a very specific reason to hide their identity, remain unrecognizable. An innocent individual in that specific area during those hours has zero reason to mask their identity. Only a person who realized their physical presence at the scene was a liability needing to be hidden would have utilized such specific precautions. Third, and most critical for the ongoing investigation, the effort to mask an identity on security footage is never flawless. Cameras record more than just faces. They document build, height, and gait, capturing the precise mechanics of movement, which serves as a unique biometric signature that remains nearly impossible to deliberately falsify. They record wardrobe choices, footwear, arm positioning during motion, head rotation angles, and the instinctive ways a suspect reacts to their immediate surroundings. Forensic gait analysis constitutes a highly specialized and recognized investigative discipline. Professionals in this field analyze video of a suspect in motion to perform comparisons against verified recordings of a known subject, security feeds, social media uploads, or any video where target's natural stride is visible allow experts to determine if the walking patterns remain consistent. It is not foolproof, but it is court admissible and represents another strand in the net the FBI is closing. That figure on the tape is not some illusion. They are a human being with a specific height, weight, and frame, possessing a unique way of moving through space that is theirs alone. The federal agents scrutinizing that video evidence have not simply been watching it. They have been dissecting it using advanced forensic tools, extracting every possible detail from the raw pixels and frames to construct a physical profile that can be verified against a specific person. When you integrate that physical assessment with the psychological profile and digital forensics recovered from the Bitcoin wallet and ransom demands, along with the touch DNA collected at Nancy's residence and the interview contradictions from associates, combined with the formal testimony of witnesses who observed behavioral red flags in the primary suspect. When you arrange every piece of this forensic evidence on a single table and view it as a whole, you see a detailed, multi-layered, and evidence-driven composite of what occurred to Nancy Guthrie, including the timeline and the perpetrator. That evidentiary view is not currently public. The FBI never discloses the total scope of an active investigation while it remains in progress. They do not reveal their strategic hand to the suspect by broadcasting their findings. Instead, they build the case in silence, verifying every lead methodically before making an arrest. However, the evidence exists, and the individual at the heart of it, whose behavioral history, physical evidence trail, and specific psychological profile align directly with every fact the investigation has yielded, is situated within the very world this case revolves around. They are in close proximity, close enough that when the handcuffs click and the trajectory of this probe indicates an arrest is imminent, those who have tracked this story from the start will not find themselves shocked by the identity of the suspect. Because the truth regarding Nancy Guthrie's abduction has been pointing toward one destination for months, leading to a conclusion the public has not yet witnessed. Where that path goes and how the final forensic pieces fit together is precisely where this criminal case reaches its conclusion. This is the final chapter. The evidence is nearly finalized. 86 days of intense investigation, 86 days of physical evidence processing, digital forensics, psychological profiling, and the exhaustive review of security footage following endless suspect interrogations. 86 days of the FBI laboring over a case involving a missing 84-year-old woman and a cryptocurrency wallet that remained untouched, eventually revealing a cold, calculated plot that was far deeper than it initially appeared. We have analyzed significant ground in this probe, starting with the core facts. Nancy Guthrie vanished, ransom notes surfaced, a specific Bitcoin address was provided, and the FBI made the tactical decision to never transmit a single dollar in payment. We analyzed the gravity of that choice, determining how profilers viewed the demand from the start and why a federal agency with massive resources would evaluate a kidnapping ransom and then consciously decide to refuse any financial engagement. We moved further into the Bitcoin wallet's technical details, examining the behavioral fingerprints left during its creation by the individual who coded it. We compared this to authentic ransom scenarios to see how they usually function, noting how Nancy's case deviated sharply from the standard patterns seen in genuine kidnapping for profit. There was no proof of life, no escalation, no sustained pressure, and zero consistent communication. 2 digital messages, a crypto wallet address, then total silence. We analyzed exactly what that silence signaled. This wasn't the quiet of a negotiator waiting for a reply or a deal put on hold. This was the stillness of a staged performance that had already reached its goal or thought it had. A storyteller had finished his work and stepped back to watch the narrative grip the public consciousness. We analyzed the motive and examined what occurs when financial gain fails to explain the offender's actions. Investigators must push into psychological and emotional ground to find the truth buried beneath the surface facts. Irrational crimes often reveal a cold internal logic when you strip away the chaos and look closer. Forging a fake ransom demand and leaking it to the press fits a very narrow behavioral profile. This individual isn't motivated by money. They are driven by a need for dominance and causing pain. That profile points toward a specific mark. We have identified that target. The target wasn't necessarily Nancy Guthrie, but the person her disappearance was intended to impact most. Savannah Guthrie is a high-profile public figure whose fame exposed her entire family to this risk. This level of exposure created a gap that her loved ones were powerless to close or defend. You cannot provide 24/7 security for every loved one or shield everyone in your orbit. Protecting them from every viewer who develops an obsessive and unwanted fixation is an impossible tactical task. Nancy served as the entry point, while Savannah was the true destination. Now the pieces are clicking together. These investigative fragments don't exist in a vacuum because they intersect and validate one another's forensic weight. The crypto wallet, erratic behavior, video footage, and forensics all converge toward a single, inevitable conclusion. Federal agents have been moving toward this specific result since the first hours of the investigation. The evidence now substantiates this theory in a way that makes logical counter-arguments nearly impossible. We begin with what Brian Entin's journalism reveals regarding the FBI's internal tactical stance. Entin's deep coverage of this probe has consistently highlighted one central, unavoidable reality for the Bureau. Federal investigators never treated this as a stalled file or some passive search for missing persons. They treated it as a high-priority solvable crime with a specific person of interest already identified. That aggressive, resource-intensive stance does not come from a place of uncertainty. It comes from having a clear target and hitting it with every asset available to the Bureau. An uncertain investigation scatters its resources and chases multiple leads at once to find any traction. It maintains broad options because the team hasn't narrowed the field enough to commit full force. A certain investigation narrows its focus and pours everything into proving what it already knows is true. It constructs the narrative around one specific person instead of maintaining a wide cast of potential suspects. It moves with a surgical precision that only comes from already knowing the final destination. Federal behavior in the Nancy Guthrie case mirrors that second, more focused type of criminal investigation. This approach is patient and directed in a way that only happens when agents are confident. The trail leads back always to the person who was never truly a stranger to the Guthrie family. This is an individual with intimate knowledge of Nancy's life who matches the staged ransom demand perfectly. Even masked and obscured on surveillance video, their physical presence carries specific identifying biometric traits. Analysts have spent weeks on this footage, while interviews have exposed massive inconsistencies in the subject's story. Seasoned investigators see these gaps as the framework of a rehearsed lie, not a genuine failure of memory. That individual has been carrying the crushing weight of their actions for 86 days straight. That pressure alters behavioral patterns and creates high-level anxiety that leaks out at unexpected moments. It generates patterns of avoidance and action that those close to the individual eventually notice. This produces a state of hypervigilance, leading to obsessive monitoring of social media and press coverage. This behavior contrasts sharply with how a truly innocent person reacts when faced with a family tragedy. Federal agents track every detail, monitoring public behavior while collecting statements from people in the suspect's circle. They are monitoring every digital footprint, from suspicious search histories to encrypted communications and traceable records. Digital footprints that a suspect under the weight of crushing guilt and paranoia inevitably leaves behind when they lose sight of the consequences. They wait with calculated intent, systematically reinforcing the evidence while adding layer after layer to a tightening forensic case file, a file that expands daily. Now, we must confront a specific theory that the public discourse surrounding this tragedy has constantly circled. This investigation has repeatedly returned to one haunting question, yet the conversation never quite lands on the most brutal possibility. Did the primary offense occur long before that first ransom demand hit the wire? This is easily the darkest theory in the entire file. When viewed in its totality, the gathered evidence points toward this specific, grim conclusion more aggressively than any other lead. Examine the timeline. Nancy Guthrie vanishes, then a notable period of silence passes before the ransom communications suddenly materialize. They used a Bitcoin wallet through platforms designed for maximum exposure. But in a standard abduction, the money demand arrives almost instantly. Demands hit, while the victim is still a viable asset, and the offender holds total leverage. Every hour wasted is a tactical failure. Silence increases the threat level for any captor. It creates windows for discovery and allows law enforcement to narrow the search radius. The window for a clean payout shrinks rapidly, and professional criminals understand that waiting is synonymous with getting caught. They strike quickly because speed maximizes their control, but the suspicious timing of the communications in Nancy's disappearance broke that fundamental rule. A glaring chronological gap exists between her initial abduction and the first demand, a delay that defies the logic of a profit-driven kidnapping. It fails the logic test of an offender holding a live victim and attempting to monetize that pressure with surgical efficiency. That delay is critical. If money was the motive, this gap represents a massive, inexplicable tactical error that no seasoned criminal makes. It is a blunder so severe that even a desperate amateur would instinctively avoid it during a high-stakes abduction. However, if the motive was never financial, if that digital wallet was merely a theatrical prop, then that silence becomes something else entirely. The delay was a staging phase, a calculated period used to engineer the communications and ready the digital stage for a false narrative. Time was spent configuring the crypto wallet and strategically planning the demand to ensure it generated the highest possible public noise. They were busy fabricating a script while the actual crime was likely already finished or entering a phase beyond any negotiation. Federal agents analyzed that dead air and reached a grim conclusion that investigators frequently find and that families always fear. It is the realization that the ransom note was not a bargaining chip, but a weapon of misdirection deployed after the fact. It likely functioned as a smokescreen rather than a legitimate offer to trade Nancy's safe return for a digital payout. It was a manufactured story crafted to divert the attention of federal investigators away from the most logical person of interest. The goal was to flood those vital first 48 hours with digital noise and a false trail that pointed toward a phantom, a lie that, if swallowed, would buy the killer exactly the window of time they required. If this assessment is correct, and the FBI's tactical movements strongly imply it is, then we face a devastating reality. The disturbing truth is that Nancy Guthrie likely was not being held in some hidden location waiting for a payout. The fatal act might have been finalized long before the public even realized a crime was underway. That dark possibility has loomed over the search from day one, acting as the silent terror behind every official update. It has haunted every press briefing and every dispatch from field reporters like Brian Entin, who have tracked this case relentlessly. Those following the case closely recognize what the data is screaming, even while officials refuse to say the words out loud. This realization changes the entire architecture of justice. If Nancy was never coming home, this is no longer a rescue mission. With no victim to recover, the investigation shifts from a rescue to a homicide inquiry. It shifts into a hunt for accountability for a brutal act committed by someone who thought they were clever enough. They believed they had engineered a perfect fiction to shield themselves from the fallout of their own violent choices. This individual challenged a federal machine, betting against the FBI's vast resources and their teams of seasoned behavioral analysts. They thought a simple Bitcoin wallet could act as a barrier against forensic experts and elite digital investigators. Those fake ransom notes were never going to stop the momentum of the truth. They were never going to be enough. Here is the raw truth about staged scenes. The fabrication always serves as a mirror for the person who created it. Every decision made to build a false reality, every lie included, and every truth omitted comes from one specific criminal mind. Every nuance of how they presented the story to the public was a signature. That mind, no matter how precise, left tracks. A suspect leaves a psychological footprint on everything they touch. That Bitcoin wallet was not a wall protecting the truth. It was actually a window into the suspect's cognitive process, revealing their specific technical knowledge and how they view law enforcement. It showcased their grasp of cryptocurrency and their flawed understanding of how high-profile ransom cases are actually processed. The suspect studied the media, analyzing exactly where police would look and for how long. Every assumption made regarding investigator tactics is etched into every stage detail they constructed, yet every single tactical error they committed became a massive flaw in the wall they built, and the FBI walked through that gap 86 days ago. Investigators have remained there ever since. Now, only final confirmation remains. The closing pieces of hard physical evidence are snapping into place. Every tiny contradiction in the interviews is being logged, and the final forensic reports are being finished as lab results get cross-referenced against biological samples. Each frame of grainy surveillance video is being verified and finalized to support one conclusion. This 86-day manhunt is now reaching its absolute breaking point. We are moving toward the arrest, where a specific name is typed onto charges and Nancy Guthrie receives a public accounting for the elaborate performance designed to mask the crime. That definitive second has not arrived yet, but the path of the case, resource-heavy, scientifically backed, and behaviorally sound, is now impossible to ignore. This operation has moved with singular purpose since the beginning, pointing toward a conclusion that is now becoming undeniable. The FBI never sent the Bitcoin because they realized the wallet was a decoy. The ransom demand was pure theater. They recognized the entire production was a stalling tactic for a subject who had already finished their work long ago. For 86 days, the FBI has built an airtight case to ensure that when they strike, the charges stick. Nancy Guthrie and her grieving family deserve justice. The dark truth must be told in full, regardless of how painful it becomes, without the staged distortions created by a suspect who thought they could outsmart a federal investigation. This person believed a digital wallet and a public ransom note provided total cover. They were wrong. They were not clever. The FBI knows the truth, and very soon, the world will too.